I would simply say the New York Times is wrong. I won't do that. I will say that's one way of defining capitalism, but it is by no means either the only one or the one that an awful lot of us use. Let me tell you why. First of all, markets. We don't need capitalism for markets. Remember your little bit of history you all have had about, say, the American slave South. Remember what they had? They had markets. They bought and sold cotton, they bought and sold African people, etc., etc. So a market doesn't give you capitalism, isn't synonymous with capitalism. Feudal manners sold objects in markets. How about a private enterprise? Well, whatever the word means, it has to mean sort of not a state enterprise, because that about exhausts it. A private enterprise or some collective body owns it. Were there private slave enterprises? Of course there were. Private enterprise has nothing to do with capitalism. It's a very bizarre usage. Well, how about this one, which is the one I find persuasive? That we have in the history of the world kind of patterns of economic systems. The three that get the most attention are slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. And it's interesting that they get the most attention because they are both different and alike. And I think if I tell you the differences and the alikes, you get a sense of what capitalism is, which we can then use for the rest of the evening. So let's start with the slave. Interesting about slave economics. There's basically two positions you can have in the slave economy. You're either a master or a slave. And it's kind of interesting because the slave does all the work, or the slaves do all the work. And whatever the slaves produce belongs to the master as fast as they produce it, because the slave himself or herself belongs to the master. Their property is what slavery means. So it's kind of peculiar. In a slave system, you got two positions, master-slave. The slave produces everything, and then the master, interestingly, gives back to the slave a portion of what the slaves produce so that the slaves can survive and do it again tomorrow. Part of what the slave produces, the master keeps for himself and his family and so on. But he has to give part of it back, otherwise the system dissolves. So you might say, and some theorists have, that the slave economy is a master-slave relationship in which the slave produces more than he keeps. The more is, another word for more could be, surplus. So that the slave produces a surplus, that is, the slave produces more than the slave consumes. And the master gets that and uses it as he will because he's the master. Now we go to the feudal system. It's different. Nobody owns anybody. Feudalism does not have people owning people, so it's not slavery. But in a feudal system, you again have something interesting. Two positions. The serf and the lord. And you notice something. The serf does a lot of work on the land that he cultivates, and he keeps some of it for himself and his consumption, and the rest of it he delivers to the lord on whose land he sits. The word in feudal Europe for this delivery was called rent. And it has a lovely warm ring to it ever since. It's what you enjoy paid to whoever you pay rent to. The serf enjoyed it about the same. Notice the two positions. The serf produces surplus for the lord. And the lord then uses it, for example, to build spectacular homes that you can visit on the Loire River in France at any time you like, just to see how munificent it was. Or the Schloss on the Rhine, or the, And then Marx comes along and says, this capitalism, it made a revolution, this capitalism did, against slavery, as in the United States Civil War that Marx wrote a lot about. And capitalism made a revolution against feudalism. That was the French and American revolutions that you all know about. And it said it was radically different. It was freedom for everybody. It was liberation. The French Revolution, remember? Liberty, equality, fraternity, the great slogans. And in America, democracy. Liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy. Capitalism would bring them all. And Marx, you know, was a young man, born in 1818. By the way, just coincidentally, this is the 200th anniversary of his birth. I'm sure you'll want to file that away. For those of you who are interested, it's May 5th, his actual birthday. Cinco de Mayo. So Marx comes along, and here's what he does. He says, you know, it was a breakthrough. They did overcome slavery. They did overcome feudalism. They revolted in all those revolutions. And they did bring a new system, capitalism. But they didn't bring the liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy they promised. If you ever study Marx's own personal history, that's why he became a radical. He loved the French Revolution. He was part of a generation that venerated that. But when he was a young man looking around Germany in 1848, he saw capitalism replacing feudalism for sure. But liberty, equality, and fraternity, Germany in 1848 looked a lot like Charles Dickens's London of that time. If you remember the Dickens you read, liberty, equality, and fraternity wouldn't be the first words that sprang to mind to describe the condition of those people. And so Marx said to him, what happened here? What is it about capitalism that betrayed its promise? And he said the answer is that capitalism, while different from slavery and feudalism, is also like it in a profound way. And what is that way? Two positions. You're either the employee or you're the employer. And then in Capital, particularly Volume 1, he proceeds to show you how and why and where the employee produces the surplus upon which the employer lives. Only the employer can't face it. So the employer calls it profit. And in an act of unspeakable modesty, attributes it to himself. I did it. I am an entrepreneur. And I, by the magic of my brilliance, have figured out how to make this thing. The poor worker, I do him a favor. I give him a job. Marx says, clever. You exploit the crap out of him, take the surplus, and claim you are the producer of profit. Nice move. It's right up there with, we didn't have anything to do with it. Jesus did it. It plays the same role historically, doesn't it? Okay, so we know then Marx helps us understand that capitalism is a system whose key relationship is employer-employee. That when you go to work for an employer, and the employer agrees to pay you $20 an hour, you all know what Marx explains to us in great detail. You know that the only reason an employer will ever pay you $20 an hour is because in the hour that you work, you add more to what that employer sells than $20 worth. Your being there for $20 he pays you gets him, ready, more than that. That's why he's hiring you. If you didn't, if your work added $20 to his output to sell, then he'd sell it, get the 20, pay you, and what's he doing? He got nothing. And while he dearly loves you, he will not hire you, or not for very long. In other words, the condition of your employment in capitalism is that you produce a surplus for the employer. And if you don't, you're dead. or what the capitalist equivalent is, you're unemployed. Gee, turns out capitalism isn't that different. Of course then, it can't bring liberty, equality, and fraternity. Why not? Because, for example, in this system, you have an unspeakable, absurd conflict built into your economics. The conflict of the employer and the employee. The less the employer pays you per hour, the more's left for him. He's right at you all the time. He's measuring how many minutes you're in the bathroom. He wants you working. In the bathroom, you produce something which I hope he doesn't sell. Right? But when you're at your computer or at your workbench, you are producing what he will sell. He needs you to be there. They're on you all the time. They hire people whose job it is to torture you into more work and less relaxation. They don't use those words because those aren't clever. They talk about your efficiency and so on. You know, this is like arranging a picnic in your extended family. 50 people get together once a year for a picnic. And you always have to have a little committee to get the food together and cook the hot dogs and all the rest. And suppose you knew that in your family people got along pretty well, except for Uncle Harry and Aunt Louise. They hate each other. They get together and it's awful. What kind of a family would arrange to have a picnic and create the committee to put the picnic together composed of Uncle Harry and Aunt Louise? You'd have to be crazy. That's a recipe for a picnic from hell. Capitalism puts into the core of the production process people who don't like each other, don't trust each other, are at each other's throats, and gain by the dilemmas they can impose on others. Of course the system is messed up. Of course there are unions. Of course there are strikes. Of course there are sabotage. Of course. You know the word sabotage, right? Sabot is that wooden shoe. The workers threw it into the machines to undermine the boss. Why did they do that? Because they enjoyed throwing wooden objects? No. They were angry at the boss. You know, the way you sometimes feel with your boss. And if you're like most people, you feel it a lot more often than you are aware of. Because you were well bred as young people and you know you're not supposed to feel that way. And then you imagine that if you don't feel that way consciously, you don't feel that way at all until you get help, and then you realize it doesn't work like that. Capitalism is a system that is fundamentally conflictual. It is a problem. But no sooner do you understand feudalism, slavery, and capitalism and how they're alike, some people producing a surplus snatched by other people, taken by other people, then almost in the understanding begins to emerge in your mind, as it did in Marx's. And by the way, if it did emerge in your mind, what I'm about to say, as it did emerge in Marx's, then it's possible, I say this with great hesitance, that you are a Marxist. And be sure not to tell your friends and relatives, unless you're sure they are too. So here's the thought that could emerge. Idea. Could we have an economic system that, unlike slavery, unlike feudalism, and unlike capitalism, is not dichotomized, not split into one side, one group of people that produce a surplus that another group of people get? Is that conceivable? Because that might get you out of the horrific conditions culminating in violent revolutions that have shaken every one of those systems. Slavery didn't end nicely. We had a civil war in this country, the worst war this country's ever had around that subject. The French Revolution, you know, guillotines, unpleasant. Is there a system that wouldn't cut people into two antagonistic combatants this way? The answer is obvious. You don't need me, but I'm going to tell you. Because you all know what this is. Marx is clever. At one point he says, half of what I write is just putting down what I've gotten from talking to people, but that they have blocks against saying themselves. It reminds me of certain comedians whose style of comic work is to simply get up on the stage and say all the things that are in all of our minds, but we're too polite to say. And we'd really enjoy it if someone would say it, and it wouldn't be us, so we don't get into trouble. We want to hear them, but we don't want to be the ones responsible for saying it. It's part of the reason so much humor is sexual. Right? We think the thoughts, but we know we're not supposed to go there. So we really appreciate a comedian who does that for us. Because then if there's a problem, it's his fault or her fault, not my fault. I sometimes think of myself as a comedian, but instead of sex, it's political stuff. Right? I say the things that you all have in your minds too. But you don't want to get into trouble. You prefer if I do that part. At least you can enjoy hearing it. You can enjoy what is indeed enjoyable about it. Well, here's the answer. This kind of arrangement for producing things is as old as the human race. We don't need a new one. We need to recognize what's always been there. So let me give you an example from American history of people who arranged a workplace that doesn't dichotomize. It's a religious group in colonial America, although it's still around. It's called the Shakers. Some of you may know about them. They produce a fantastic, simple design furniture that has lasted, and you can still get it. Beautiful, beautiful work. Some of you know? Yes? Okay. Outside of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in western Massachusetts, is their major place. They have a museum, and it's still functioning, and they will take you on tours there. If you're ever in that area, it's well worth it. The Shakers. Why were they called that? Well, some of you will find this more interesting than the economics. Here we go. They didn't believe in sex. And therefore, they clearly had a number of problems that flowed from this belief. But religions have never shied away from the problems occasioned by their beliefs. Otherwise, well, I won't go there. So the Shakers didn't have sex. So what they did, in order to, I want to say this carefully, to discharge energies that were building up, they shook. They got together and they shook in ecstasy around God and whatever. I'm no expert on their religious thing, but they shook, and they were called Shakers for that reason. Well, you might wonder, how could they have survived all these hundreds of years given the problem I just described? And the answer, which will interest particularly